Welcome to ADORNit's online class. I'm Eileen Johnson, and I'm here to give you some tips and tricks on some of the things that we're working on today, which is the lemon tree quilt. You might have seen the lemon tree quilt at Barnes & Noble, and if you did and you picked it up and you're needing some questions answered, hopefully I can help you today. I wanted to give you a couple of tips that might help you enjoy your project a little more. I have sewn for years, and sometimes I can get really frustrated myself when things don't match up properly or things don't go right. And so I thought I might share with you a couple of techniques that might help you to make your sewing experience more enjoyable. One of the things that I want to talk about is when you are cutting your squares, oftentimes people will have a mat, something like this, then they will have a clear ruler, and they will have a rotary blade. If you put your fabric down onto the mat and you use these as a guideline, sometimes your fabric won't be square and it won't be the right size. But if you take your clear ruler and you place it over the top of your fabric and you use these lines as your guide to cut, you'll have a crisper edge and your cut will be more accurate, and that will help with your piecing, and it will help you to be able to have your project come together a little bit more nicely. Another thing that I wanted to talk about was pinning. Sometimes people like to get in a hurry and they think, oh, if I don't pin, it really won't make that big of a difference. But pinning can really make a big difference, and it can help with your positioning, it can help with your sewing, and it can help with the seams coming together properly. So as I go through this tutorial, I will show you some instances where I have pinned and where it has made it go a little bit smoother. So first of all, you are going to be looking in your instruction booklet on how to put this quilt together. And you're going to be cutting several, I'm not exactly sure how many squares, quite a few squares for the background of your quilt. And in the instructions, it says to do a couple of things that are great, but if you're a beginner sewer, I'm going to give you maybe a couple of little tips on how that might go together a little easier for you. So first of all, you will find in your pattern this template, and it's a template of a leaf, and you just will cut right on the dotted line, and then you will have your leaf pattern right here. Now you can take this pattern and you can put it down, and I like to usually use a couple of layers of fabric so that I can get a few more cuts at once. And this is one of those times where if you pin, it will be really helpful. Now, if you don't want to pin at all, you can just take a pencil or a pen and you can mark around here. They also have fabric pens that will disappear with ironing, and they also have pins that you can use to write on that will disappear probably over between 48 to 72 hours. But really, it's going to be on the back side, so using a pencil or a pen is fine. And then when you go to cut out your petals, that's where I would really suggest that you use your pinning, because your pinning is going to, well, let's say that's not on there, but your design is. This will help your fabric not to move very much, and so that when you cut out your petals, both of the petals will be the same size, and you won't have any petal that's maybe a little bit shorter or a little bit longer on one side because you didn't have your fabric pinned together. So that's one of the tricks. Another thing is that on the pattern, it has you sewing your petals onto your squares before you actually arrange and put your block together. When you do that, you need to allow a certain amount of space on each side here. Most patterns will call for a 1/4 inch seam, and this pattern also calls for a 1/4 inch seam. And so if you have that seam and you're running right along there, that is why you want to go ahead and sew your petal on, leaving enough allowance so that when you sew your block together, you're not going to be sewing over that petal and catching some of it in the seam. However, we have had some of our beginner sewers say that putting the petal on has been a little bit more of a challenge. And so what I thought we could do, and I tried it and it worked great, was I went ahead and I put the block together, I sewed it together, and then I pinned my petals onto the block. And by doing that, it allowed me to have a really accurate placement of where the petal would be. And then I could get it right up there to the center, and I didn't need to worry about my seam allowance so much. Sometimes as a beginner sewer, getting your seams lined up seems to be a little bit of a challenge. One of the things that I would suggest to you is on your sewing machine, measure on your on the bar that goes beneath the pressure of the sewing foot, and measure where your needle comes down opposed to where your foot is. So say you want a 1/4 inch seam, go ahead and put your needle down and then measure to where a 1/4 inch would be. Some machines are computerized and you can set those at a 1/4 inch seam. Some of them are manual and you can't do that. Sometimes you can even put a little bit of tape down to be a guide for you, so that as you run your fabric through and you keep it right along the tape line, you'll know you're at a 1/4 inch seam, and that will help for your block to go together easier. Also, when you put your petal on, sew in about a 1/4 inch from the outside of the petal, and then you go all the way around with just a simple stitch, and that will keep this on. One of the things that helps your block to go together easier is something called nesting. Now that all of you sewers who have been sewing for years, you will be familiar with this term. But what nesting is when you are taking your blocks, your squares, and you are sewing them together. One of the squares you're going to want to iron your seam one way, and on the other set of squares you're going to want to iron your seam the opposite way. By doing that, you can set your pieces on top of one another with this seam going this way, this seam going that way, and then this is called nesting, where you can match that seam right up, and it almost is like it fits together. It wants to nest right in there, and then you can pin it so that when you sew your block together, you can get a nice sharp corner or centerpiece where your block comes together really nicely and doesn't look off. When you are done with sewing all of your blocks together and all of your petals are sewn, then you will just follow the instructions for the rest of the quilt. You've done most of the hard part, and now basically all you're going to be doing is you're going to be sewing these blocks together in strips and then in rows, and then you will put a border and a binding around the outside. So I hope that these tips and tricks have helped you. I hope that you have an enjoyable experience with your sewing and that your project turns out nicely. It makes it a lot more fun and enjoyable when you get done and you feel like, oh, I accomplished that, my seams look great, things worked out well, and it makes you want to try another project. So again, welcome to our online course for ADORNit. I'm Eileen Johnson, and I am here to teach you about the lemon tree quilt.